Thank you. I appreciate your concern. It's obviously valid. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. As I said a few minutes ago, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here for this final lecture in this year's installment of the Carson Lecture. After a wonderful time together this morning and yesterday evening, I'm happy to introduce to you again Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Before I do so, a couple of things that I'd like to say. First of all, we have a lot of the members of the Royer family here, the family in whom this lecture series, by whom this lecture series was established. They're at this back table over here. I'm not going to make you stand, but would you wave hands while we thank you? Thank you all so much for making this series possible, for what it has meant to this community, to this church. On the screen behind me are the faces of all of the Carson lecturers over the years that I could find. That is quite a crew of lecturers. There are some recognizable faces up there, both nationally and locally. The church I am very, very grateful for what this series has meant. And as I said last night when we gathered for the first part of this lecture, I'm grateful and I'm hopeful about what will be next. So I wanted to get their faces in front of you. On to our final iteration of this lecture this year. If you have not yet had a chance to meet her this weekend, standing next to me is Dr. Diana Butler Bass. She is a writer and a scholar and a spiritual leader whose work bridges the academy and the church and the public sphere. With a doctorate from Duke and now 12 books to her name, Diana brings deep insight and lively, accessible style to her exploration of faith in our time. Whether she's unpacking the language of gratitude, as she will be today, or reimagining the future of the church, or reflecting on how God moves in our everyday lives, she always invites us to think deeply and to live faithfully. So once again, please welcome Dr. Diana Butler Bass.
Thank you. I don't know, Matt, was that sent to you by Jim Chafee? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
You wrote that one?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm so glad that's not the AI thing that he pulled down from the internet. That's why I was asking. It's been good to be with you over this last evening and this morning to talk about gratitude and related concepts. I just want to remind folks, if you haven't already done so, you can sign up for my, do we have that? Sorry. That's okay, no worries. One little technological thing to do here. Let's see if that works. Oh, plug in twice. Oh. Now you can see, oh no, you can't see what we're doing quite there. Okay, that's good. Okay, good, it works. Okay, thank you. The remote. I have a Substack newsletter called The Cottage, and that's the email address. But I also put on the tables sign-up sheets. So if you want us to sign you up to receive this, and there are free and paid versions of it, so you're welcome to just get it for free, and that is fantastic. If you want to get a subscription for the year, that's pretty fantastic too. That really helps me be able to keep this project going. I'm very, very proud of the cottage. For a long time, it was the 5th most popular newsletter in the religion and spirituality category. And what was interesting about those top 5 newsletters, one was about the Catholic Church, a kind of news servicey thing. Another one was by some guy writing a prophecy newsletter. You can imagine that he got a lot of subscribers. But the other 3 of the top 5 were women. Me, Nadia Boltz-Weber, and then it would go back and forth between Sarah Bessey, who is a Canadian writer, and Liz Gilbert, who is wider than a Christian writer, but she also writes in the spirituality category. So Substack has been an interesting place where women have really found their voice and a place to express ideas powerfully and to get those messages out to readers. The cottage right now has 75,000 readers. making it actually larger than the Christian century and almost as large as Christianity today. So I'm standing here right with you all, and I'm kind of just a nice, regular Fairfax County housewife. And you're also looking at Christian century. Maybe we can consider these kinds of technologies Christianity finally this century, not last century. But so anyway, it's really fun, and I want you to know that if you give me your email, I treasure it. I sell these lists to no one. You will get absolutely no advertising from anybody. I get asked all the time to sell my list, and that's part of my covenant with you. What you're getting is something from me. That's it. And I protect your email addresses. So I want you to feel safe and not like you're going to get a lot of junk in the email if you sign up for me. That's what you'll have. So that's and this is where I write, actually, my friends. We got to a point in our two-story, 1,900 square foot, 1967 colonial house in Alexandria, Virginia, kind of a modest, typical house right outside of Washington, D.C., where I had no place left for my books. And so my husband said, well, I think we're going to have to build something in the backyard. And this is what we built. A little writing cottage, my she shed, and that's where I do my work. This summer I put in a porch out front and a rocking chair. Yeah. It's all very cozy. I think that for Advent I'm going to do tea at the cottage online, so that'll be fun. Well, like I said, I'm proud of it. It's like showing you a baby picture. So that is my normal work on this wonderful, amazing project and helping out those readers discover deeper sense of God's work in the world today. And then my new book, A Beautiful Year. I got to talk about that last night. But today I'm talking about a book from 2018 called Grateful. If you ever go online to look for this book, you'll notice it has two subtitles. The first subtitle is up there, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks. That was the hardback title. It was a good book, but it also the publisher said at one point, I don't think that's quite the right subtitle. And they changed it for the paperback. And it's called, in that version, The Subversive Practice of Giving Thanks. I don't know why we had to up it from transformative to subversive, but we did. And it's this exact same book, so don't worry about that. Gratitude. There are books on gratitude. There are a lot of books on gratitude that you could spend your time learning from. And many of them are very, very, very good. Most of them, though, are a little bit alike in the sense that there's usually a book about teaching you practices, how to be grateful. There's often books that show you a journey that the author has been on. There were wonderful books for a while, these were all published, talking about how at some point, some crisis point in the author's life, they learned how to be grateful. And they spent 200 days or 365 days or some amount of time writing down gratitude lists. And then they would talk about, how this experience changed them. Those books, as I said, are all helpful and very good. A lot of them are books that have flowers on the cover. They are often very warm, sort of self-helpy books, and a lot of them cross categories between self-help and religion or spirituality. There are things in my book which are like that, the things you might expect. In a gratitude book, there's a discussion about gifts and what happens when we get gifts. There's discussion about awe and wonder and how we feel grateful for the natural world. And there's a discussion, of course, about particular practices of meditation and prayer, how gratitude is good for our hearts. So there is an incredible learning journey, I mentioned this in my sermon today, that I went on about all of this kind of stuff regarding gratitude. And much of it I still hold on to and still practice. This earlier slide that I have here, that little stone, that gratitude stone, is a river stone. It has the word gratitude on it. And I have carried that on every single trip that I have been on since I got that stone in 2000, I guess 17 maybe. It was before the book even came out. And it sits by my bed often when I'm in hotels. I pull it out when I'm on airplanes. And it's a physical reminder to be grateful. And often when I'm holding it in my hand, it's something that I simply just say, thank you, thank you. It's good to have those kinds of physical token reminders to practice gratitude. And I can practice it when I have my stone with me. It's a good reminder of how I can practice it anywhere. Anybody here ever been to Ghost Ranch in New Mexico? That's actually taken in the middle of the labyrinth. I walked the labyrinth at Ghost Ranch with my gratitude stone in my hand, and then I laid the stone down in the middle and took a picture of it so I could remember that particular walk. So in this sense, there's not that much that's terribly new in the book that I wrote about gratitude. And I wanted to share with you the part that is very different that's in my book. Gratitude books are usually warm and fuzzy self-help category type books. My book goes a slightly different direction. Instead of just staying in the sort of warm and cozy self-help space, which I'm happy to be in for a time, I began to ask the question, well, if gratitude is so good for us, why is it so hard? Because it is really good for us. It's good for us in terms of our emotions. It's good for us in terms of our physical life. It's good for us in terms of our relationships. It's good for all kinds of things in our lives. And yet, so many of us struggle with it. So why is it so hard? I realized that a big part of the problem of gratitude is we carry around inside of us certain kinds of structures around gratitude, the way we imagine gratitude to be shaped or designed, something I call the architecture of gratitude. And that architecture, that shape that we have already inside of our minds, has a huge impact on the way we practice gratitude in our lives. And it's the architecture we struggle with, I think, much more than it is the actual idea of wanting to be grateful or that gratitude is good for us. So let's look at here real quickly at this slide. This is just one of those word clouds where some sociologists, some artists, whoever created this diagram, asked people, what other words do you think of when you hear the word gratitude? And you'll notice here, gratefulness, response, thanksgiving, feeling, thanks, grateful. This is all nice words. The word positivity is even there, spirit, appreciate, kind, etc. There's one word that's really pretty big, though, that rests very close to the central word, and that is that word right there, obligation. Now, I don't know about you all, but when I see the word obligation, I do not get the warm fuzzies. That's not a word you often see in self-help books or books that are in the sort of spirituality category. Obligation is something that makes us feel bad. It's a requirement. It puts us in debt to somebody or something else when we're obligated. And it is that part of gratitude that I think often makes the practice of gratitude and even talking about gratitude pretty difficult. A friend of mine is a Methodist pastor. His name is Jason Michelli. And he's a wonderful, wonderful pastor. He's also a very successful podcaster. And well over a decade ago, it's probably about 15 years ago, he's a pretty young guy, and he was diagnosed with a form of cancer that usually only strikes people when they're in their 70s. And when he got this cancer, his doctor said that he did not have long to live because nobody ever really survives this cancer. but that they very rarely see it in young people. And so they don't really know if it was possible to cure it in younger folks who might have this disease. And so they said, can we try new things on you? And so Jason became a bit of a guinea pig for this whole big protocol related to this cancer, that if it worked on younger adults, perhaps some form of it might work on older adults. But to this point, it had always failed. Well, that meant that Jason, the pastor at a very large, very successful Methodist church, all of a sudden found himself in a position where he had to receive a lot of stuff, help, gifts, etc., from his congregation, from the people around him. And he did not like that. It made him feel really bad. He had to have people drive him to cancer treatments. He wrote a book about this called Cancer is Funny, which of course it isn't. The title is ironic. But he talked about how he remembers having congregants have to hold his hair back while he was throwing up in the toilet, or cleaning up his car, or cleaning up their cars after they had taken him someplace. The parishioners delivering meals. It was making him crazy that he basically went from being the pastor of this church, where he had basically all the control and the authority and all this sort of stuff, to being in a position of nearly complete helplessness. And his congregation was remarkable. They really rose to the moment and cared for him and cared for his family. And he talks about, this was in a Thanksgiving sermon, after he had gone through all the treatment and he was essentially cleared. He had to still go through some form of treatment every single month for the rest of his life. But he was in remission, and they thought that the remission would stick if he kept with this protocol. So he came back to the church, preached a Thanksgiving sermon, and this was in that sermon. He said, I've always been awful at receiving gifts. I hate being in another's debt. I was the guy who kept score, which means I didn't mind you being in my debt. I just didn't want to be in yours. And that was the way Jason, who was then right around 40, that was the definition that he had grown up with about gratitude, is that gifts put you in the debt of the giver. When I was doing this project, I learned something quite odd, and I'm sorry to have to report this, but there's an international study of attitudes towards gratitude. Americans have very mixed attitudes about gratitude in terms of survey takers. American women like the practice of gratitude, but American men generally don't. And I really began to wonder if this had to do something with American individualism, this sort of idea of the John Wayne. But when Jason preached this sermon, oh, that's it. Men get really worried if they think they have to be in someone else's debt. There's a structure inside that can act as a block to getting what gratitude is really about. American women don't appear to have quite the same level of resistance to the word. For what it's worth, and again, I'm really sorry to say this, but in that study, American men ranked lowest in the world in their ability to give and accept gratitude. And the highest in the world were German men, interestingly enough. So gratitude is often associated with these two terms that Jason articulated so clearly: indebtedness and obligation. Well, where in the world does that come from? Where do we get this idea that somehow gratitude is about owing someone something? Last night, I started my talk with a question that's at the beginning of A Beautiful Year, a question that was an internet meme. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Well, as I said last night, I think about the Roman Empire all the time since I'm a church historian. And this is long before I wrote the book A Beautiful Year. I was thinking about the Roman Empire when I was writing Grateful. This is the social structure of ancient Rome. That's on the board behind me. You can see it's shaped like a pyramid. At the top is the emperor, and then come senators. Those are the nobles, a very elite class of people who basically have power depending upon the power of the emperor. Then come the equestrians, and that's aristocratic families, wealthy and influential landholding people, oftentimes associated with military service. Then come plebeians, working peoples. Foreigners, those are visitors from other parts of the empire. And usually those visitors are from client states of Rome, states that Rome might have captured in war, or states that were dependent on Rome for economic largesse. And then finally, at the bottom of the social pyramid were slaves. Slaves had no rights and had to obey their masters. And this is how Roman society was structured. These kinds of structures I always think are very interesting structures because they are inherently unstable. Because it's the people at the top of this pyramid who have the most power and wealth. And it's the people at the bottom, where there's the most people, who have the least amount of power and wealth. So when you look at it one way, it's a pyramid, you think, oh, pyramids are always stable because they have big, wide bottoms. But if you invert them to look at how power and wealth are distributed throughout the system, you get the opposite picture. You get the people at the top have a tremendous amount of stuff, the very few people have a lot, and the very many people have a very little, so it's an inverted pyramid. And that means that when it comes to wealth and power, the pyramid is standing on its point. That is not a stable social structure. That is a social structure that is always sort of under threat of collapse. This is also the social structure that was operative during the time of the New Testament. Behind every New Testament story is this social structure. The Jews are being held as a client state to this empire, which means functionally pretty much everybody in ancient Israel is in the bottom three categories, most in the bottom category. If they're not formally slaves, they're treated as such. They're very, very poor people who have to pay enormous amounts of their local wealth to an extractive empire that's located in Rome. And so you hear and see Jesus talking about this on many different occasions. And many questions in the New Testament are related to this. The question of, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? That's a question that's related to this social structure right here. Now, most of the time, social structures like this, because they're unstable, are kept in order by two forces. One is a vast and powerful military. You terrify people into submission. And hey, the Roman army still terrifies us. I watch those movies too, and it's like, oh no, keep them away from me. You know, keep those soldiers far away from me. And that's exactly what is happening too in the New Testament. I don't know, you know that story about Jesus throwing the pigs throwing the demons into the pigs, and the pigs are named Legion. Well, most contemporary scholars think that what that was is a very not so subtle attack on a Roman legion that was stationed nearby. And that Jesus wasn't talking about real pigs, he was actually talking about the Roman troops that were stationed nearby, and that they were the place where the demons went. And so we don't think about that so often. We think of it as a story about some pigs who were inhabited by demons called Legion. Well, maybe it really was a Roman legion. because there was a very fierce Roman legion that was near where Jesus was there. Herod, that king that we hear about all the time in the New Testament, his ancestor was made the king of Israel. You think, oh, king of Israel must be a descendant of David. Nope. This guy was an interloper who wasn't even really fully Jewish. He was an Edomite. And he happened to be a friend of a guy named Mark Antony. And so when Mark Antony was in this part of the world looking for a client king to set up for Caesar back in Rome, he went to his friend Herod and said, hey, you kind of know what it means to be a Jew, and you know this place, so what if I get you set up as king? And Herod said, that sounds like a really good idea. I'd like to be king. Who doesn't want to be king? So that's how Herod and his descendants got to the throne. They were actually put on the throne by Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And so how many times do you think about that when we read those Christmas stories? This is a client king of Rome, put on the throne by Mark Antony. And it's all kinds of stuff like that, all through the New Testament. Is this structure, the fear of that military, the power of these people in Rome, it's always there. Now, of course, these are Jews who are writing this text, and they're under this empire. So guess what they've got to do? They've got to be kind of quiet about it when they're writing their stuff, because they don't want to get arrested and thrown in jail. They don't want to be seen as seditionists traitors. So they're oftentimes coding what's going on around them. And then, of course, it's invisible to us because we just don't live in the ancient Roman Empire. But it is there. So one thing you do is you have a big military. The second thing you do is you think of some clever economic way to make the people on the bottom always need you as the people on the top. And so this is the way Rome did it. They created a system that was actually referred to as the gratus system. Exact same word from which we get our English word gratitude. And this is what it looked like in operation. As you see, Caesar up there, along with the nobility, are at the top of the pyramid. This is a slightly more abbreviated pyramid than the last one we saw, but it's basically the same. And that Caesar was referred to in the ancient Roman world as the Lord and Savior of the universe. This was actually one of his titles. You know how the King of England has all those titles? Well, Caesar had a ton of titles too. And so he was referred to as the Lord and Savior of the universe, of the world. And he was the ultimate benefactor of all of the people who were under him. And his responsibility as Lord and Caesar, as the giver, he was seen as the giver of all things, was to pass good things down, to pass down gratus to everyone who was underneath of him. And gratus, the stuff that you needed as a person who is at the bottom of the pyramid, would be things like protection, provision, and public goods. You needed a safe place to be with your family. You needed food to eat. And it was really good to live in the Roman Empire because there were good roads, there was clean water, etc., etc. And so that was Caesar's job, to pass that stuff down the pyramid along with his friends, the rest of the nobility. And they passed it down to the people who were immediately below them in social class. Here it's referred to as the brokers. And that was the military, the bureaucrats, and other people who were sort of in the middling place in society. They were the distributors of Caesar's gratus, of Caesar's benefaction. And then at the bottom are the clients. Now, clients is a funny word in English right now because we think of clients as you have a client relationship with someone you go and see. So you might be the client, your dentist, your client of your dentist. You pick your dentist. A lawyer, you might be a client of a lawyer. There's all kinds of people you could be a client of. But we live in a democratic country where we get to choose the people who we become clients of. That's not what happened in this world. In this world, client is not that kind of good word. It essentially means subject. You are the subject, and in some ways, really an object of the people at the top. And the people who were at the bottom, the best layer you could be in, like the Apostle Paul, was that you could be a citizen. But then most of the people were subject peoples, just sort of whose lands and places had been claimed by Rome. And then you have the enslaved at the very, very bottom of that group. And so if you are at the very bottom of the group, and if you have anything, a crumb to eat on any day, you have it because Caesar, the Lord and Savior of the universe, gave it to you. You were required by law to return thanks to Caesar. There are actually a set of laws in the ancient Roman world that make ingratitude a crime. And what had to happen at the bottom levels, these are the things you were obligated to return to Caesar: loyalty, money through your tithes and taxes, and then finally, actual worship and thankfulness. The physical worship of your body and soul. Go to a temple and say thank you to a statue of Caesar. This is, of course, what the Jews objected to so very strongly. And so the people, when they returned these things up the pyramid, they were required to do so by law. So the beneficiaries then have to return their gratus to Caesar. That's what this stuff is called as it goes around the whole system. Caesar passes down his gratia, his grace and favor, through protection, provision, and public goods. And then the people who are the recipients, even at the very bottom, have to return their gratus, their gratitude, back up the system through their loyalty. Yes, Caesar, you are the Lord and Savior. We love you, Caesar. We will never defy you. We will obey every single thing you say. Their tithes and taxes, we get that. We know what those things are. And then finally, their worship. And then they'd give that stuff to the intermediaries. You know, like Zacchaeus, the tax collector in the New Testament, all those tax collectors? That's what those guys were doing. They were the intermediaries who were collecting stuff from the people at the bottom in order to transport those things back up to Caesar in Rome. And so that's this system. Gratia comes down from the top, gratus moves up. And it was all held together by force of law. And if you didn't do this, if you didn't participate in the system, if you said, nope, forget it, I do not want to be your client, Caesar, you could have your lands taken, your wife stolen from you, your kids forced to serve in the Roman army. You could be sent into exile. You could be imprisoned and publicly humiliated. There's all kinds of things that could happen to you. And so this is what kept Rome together. No bread for you unless you follow the law and give me back loyalty, any largesse that you possibly have, and worship. And if you do those things for me, your life is going to be great. It will all be fine. Now you can imagine what happens in this picture, because the whole system is basically about this. It's about the rich having stuff that they transport down to people who have open hands, who are waiting for this. And that means a whole bunch of possibilities here. You can see them in the picture. Is that when Caesar passes stuff down, it's really interesting that less always gets to the bottom than what Caesar intended. Because there's people in the middle, well, you know how it goes. Just skim a little off the top while it's moving down. Caesar understands. I need a little more for my estates because, hey, I have a tough life. I need a break on my taxes. I'll just go ahead and I'll just skim a little off the top. Those people don't really need it. They don't work as hard as me. And then by the time it gets to the bottom, of course, there's more people fighting for even less than what was passed down at the beginning. And those people struggle to have to try to figure out how they're going to get their goods and services back up. They finally get enough money together to pay their taxes or whatever, and what do you got? You got a guy there named Zacchaeus, and you know what's happening on that end. Zacchaeus is taking a little off the top. But he's passing it back up. All these people in this system, the higher up you were, the wealthier you got all the time, because you had more that you could skip from. There were no honest brokers anywhere in this economic system. And yet, because of the whole political part connected to it, is that there was no recourse at all for the people on the bottom. You could not vote these people out. You couldn't go to a rally and say, no emperors, because you would wind up dead. The Roman army would come and get you. And there would be not a second that you could wear your frog costume anywhere in the streets of Rome. And so this is a world that is set. And it is set with corruption. And it is set with the rich getting richer and richer and richer, and the poor having less and less and less. The two main abuses in this system were, first of all, this is a contemporary phrase, but it explains an ancient practice, quid pro quo. The rich figured out fairly quickly, there were lots of different ways to make money off of the system. One is that you could skim from the top, that's the obvious way. And the less obvious way is to target your gifts in order to get something that you wanted. And there are actually examples of this in some of Jesus's parables, where there would be a rich man, and he would see certain kinds of lands that he would want. And what you would do is you would go to, say, a landholder and say, oh, I see that you're struggling to pay your taxes, so I'll give you a break this year, or I'll give you a break for 5 years, and, just pay me less. And the landholder's going, or the person who works a small farm goes to the landholder, oh, that's great, I really do need a break on my taxes. I'll pay you. But of course, then that farmer has 5 bad years. There might be a drought, some disease strikes his sheep, whatever, and the 5 years are up. He can't pay all the money that he's owed to the landholder, who seemed to be giving him a gift at the beginning. And then the landowner looks at him and says, well, you can't pay your taxes, I'm taking your land. And see, it's a targeted gift. You give me something, or I'll give you something so that I can get something in return. There was never any attempt to benefit that farmer. That person who made that deal at the beginning knew it would always wind up this way, and that he was using the system in order to steal from others. Quid pro quo. It's a way of trying to control others by the use of gifts. Jesus spoke about this very directly. It shows up, there's quid pro quo. It shows up very, very, very directly here. This verse from Luke 14. I have rarely heard this verse preached on. It's really interesting that we don't hear it that often in the lectionary. He said, that is Jesus, also to the one who had invited him. So this is one of those famous dinner invitation kind of arguments that they're having in the New Testament. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they might invite you in return and you would be repaid. Jesus is literally saying, do not practice quid pro quo with dinner invitations. And this was one of the primary ways that quid pro quo was practiced in the ancient world. You invited somebody to dinner, guess what? You were obligated to that person to do something for them in return. And so Jesus says, don't do this. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. Jesus, in this little statement, is taking down the economic system of ancient Rome. And we don't recognize it because we don't live there. It is a direct arrow right at the heart of the gratus system. Do not practice this kind of exchange or transactional use of food. Don't do it. And Jesus then goes on, of course, and he says, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. So you step outside of this economic system, that is going to be a blessing to you. And then he goes on, he says, but you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now that's not a quid pro quo, because the people who were listening to Jesus, when was the resurrection of the righteous? Who knows? Sometime a really long time now. We have no idea. So in other words, what you have here in this passage is Jesus attacking the Roman economic system, and then him telling a joke about it. Because this is a Jesus joke. Jesus says, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, and you know when that is. Who knows when it is? It's so long in the future that you won't even remember the dinner when this happens for you. And so this, to me, becomes really, this is a very powerful vision. Jesus is saying, do not participate in obligatory gratitude. Do not put other people in your debt with gifts. Instead, the movement of gifts should be free. For all people, to all people, all the time, with no intention of any obligation to return the favor. It's really stunning. The Latin expression, quid pro quo, this is just an explanation for it. It means, it was originated more in the 16th century, the way we use it today in English. It means this for that. And it indicates a transaction where two parties make a mutual exchange. Mutual, it should be in parentheses here. This is given because that is expected. And so, but it's a very ancient practice. The second problem, and we'll go back just real quick to the picture here of the pyramid. The second problem with this, now you can see how all the skimming works. That's pretty obvious in the first picture. Then you have the big problem of quid pro quo, the targeted abuse of the system in order for the people who have power to gain more power. There's another really terrible problem in this system. And I alluded to it just a moment ago when I told a revision of one of the parables, is when there's a seeming gift that relieves the people who are at the bottom of the system, but it's actually just a sort of targeted form of abuse. And that happened a lot, is that the poor were put in positions where they would have to borrow huge amounts of money simply to pay their tithes to Caesar in order to keep their lives safe. And they were highly dependent on things like farming and fishing in order to meet those obligations. And anybody who's ever lived on the land in any way, shape, or form, either, I don't do that. I'm a freelance writer, though, so I do understand a little bit about this, is that you are really dependent upon how the weather is, what's going to happen around you, circumstances that are well out of your control. And if you have a bad year, you can't pay your taxes. That I know. And so what would happen here in the Roman Empire is that the poor would get into a problem of tremendous amounts of debt. Now, the poor in the ancient Roman Empire were not borrowing money to go to college. They were not borrowing money to pay their mortgages. They were not doing any of the kinds of things we usually think. They were not like credit cards. These were extractive arrangements whereby the poor were desperately trying to meet their obligations in order to save their own lives and the lives of their families. And they would go into some form of debt in order to do that. And those debts, there was no laws guarding them, essentially. And it was really up to literally dishonest brokers in every front to try to cover the needs of these people. And what was happening is the poor would just get so weighted down with debt that they would functionally find themselves enslaved. And sometimes actually enslaved to the people who had tried to fill in the gaps of what they had to pay Caesar by law. It was a terrible system. And just out of curiosity, I looked up the word debt, one of those online dictionaries, and this was the definition that came up. I think it's sort of intriguing that you get the first one is something, typically money, that is owed or due. And so the state of owing money is then explained. But then look at what the bottom definition of debt is. A feeling of gratitude for a service or favor. We owe a debt of gratitude. And that's what my friend Jason was talking about. He said he didn't want to owe anybody anything. And that somehow getting a gift created a debt that had to be discharged. Now, in ancient Rome, it really did that. It literally actually created a debt that had to be discharged or you would die. Now, we still are carrying that idea around with us, even though your grandmother is not going to kill you for not sending a thank you note. And so debt is really part of that triangle-shaped system that has given us the language of gratitude. We prayed this today. I love being in Presbyterian churches because you pray it right. In my childhood Methodist church or my grown-up Episcopal church, we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And it's like, I remember being a little kid asking my mom, what's a trespass? I didn't know what it was. And some people say sins to make it straightforward. But this is a very squirrely word in the New Testament. Because the word in one version, I believe it's in Luke, that is used is really to indicate sin. Forgive us our sins. But I believe it's Matthew. Did I get this right or did I reverse them? Matthew uses this other word that literally is debt, monetary debt. When this prayer is put out. And so wait a second, are you kidding me? Is that the Lord's Prayer is saying, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors? And this is about money? Yes. That's exactly right. Because when Jesus was asked by his disciples, how should we pray? Jesus answers. He answers in Aramaic. And the word was probably the word that Matthew puts in there because Matthew always has these highly Jewish interests in mind, where Luke is always adapting things to a Roman audience. Matthew's really sticking very close to the stories of the text that came before, the First Testament. And so Matthew, when he says debt, that should mean that every single person who heard Jesus say that was thinking of the word at the bottom of this illustration, the Jubilee. Remember the Jubilee back in the Old Testament? Is that when God established the law, the covenant with Israel, there were certain practices related to holding people in debt and related to work and money. For example, every single Sabbath, everyone refrained from work. And what that wasn't just a day of rest so that you could recover and go back into your brutal office on Monday. What it was a reminder of God's provision and of the vision of economy that God established or wanted to establish here on earth. And that was an economy of gifts and gratitude, where God provided, like the manna in the desert, and that God was setting a table in the wilderness, and that around that table there would always be food enough for everyone. Everyone pull up a chair, everyone pull up a seat. The feast is prepared for you in the wilderness. Every family shall have its own vine and fig tree, and people will live in peace. And this was what the Sabbath was supposed to represent every single week. When you refrained from work, you were to be reminded of God's economy, not the economy of empire that surrounded ancient Israel, the economy of Mesopotamia, the economy of Egypt, eventually the economies of Greece and Rome. Those were imperial economies. Economies all shaped in these triangle-shaped structures where one person controlled all the money and everybody else was at the bottom suffering. So you have the Sabbath once a week. Then once every 7 years, you would have a reversion of debt and a reversion of land. You were to lay, the land was to lay fallow once every 7 years. Don't work the land. Just live off of what the gifts of the land are without you working it, and anything that you have put away for that 1 year from the other 6 years in which you worked the land. And that was a deeper reminder of God's economy. A whole year of Sabbath. And then after 49 years, and in the 50th year, there would be the Jubilee. And the Jubilee meant a complete taking down of any kind of debt or obligation that was owed within the community. And that meant all lands reverted back to their original owners. All slaves were set free. Every single debt was canceled. And everyone had this entire year to celebrate and feast, and it was considered to be a year-long festival of God's provision. Jubilee. Sabbaths on Sunday, a year's Sabbath rest once every 7 years, and then at the end of 49 years, Jubilee. And so when Jesus said, I want you every single day to pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, the Jewish hearers in that audience went, oh my gosh, he's talking about the year of Jubilee. Every day, we are to live in relationship to one another with gifts as if it is the year of Jubilee. Many years ago, before I wrote this book, I was actually preaching at a Presbyterian church in some city in Ontario. I can't remember which one it was. It wasn't Toronto. But I was up in Canada, and I happened to be at this church that was right next to a university. And I remember going in on Sunday morning. It's kind of, it's a Canadian church, Presbyterian church, pretty small, not a huge church, brick building. And I took my robes with me up on that trip, and got there on Sunday morning, looked out at the congregation, and I saw that sitting in the congregation, there were about 20 or 25 young adults, all in the same 3 pews. And I realized what had happened is that some religious studies professor at the university next door had probably sent his class on an extra credit field trip to hear the American theologian preach in church. And so I thought, oh man, this could be a tough one. So I look out over this congregation, and it's typical looking Presbyterian churchgoers in Canada with 25 students sitting right there. And I was preaching on the Lord's Prayer. And I got to this part of the prayer, and it might have been the first time I ever realized the full power of this prayer. And there I was in my same Duke robes that I had on today. And I got very excited about it. And I was standing in a big elevated pulpit, one of those ones you had to climb up into. And I said, "Don't you see it?" And that's exactly what I was doing. "Don't you see it? Jesus dreamed of a debt-free world." And I looked out over the congregation, and the 25 students were like, and I thought, oh, that hit home. So at the line afterwards, I stayed in the back of the church, and nice Canadian Presbyterian churchgoers came up and said pleasant things, about my sermon. And then I noticed that the students had stayed in the line, and so I was like trying to dismiss the nice Canadian Presbyterian churchgoers because I really wanted to hear what those students had to say. And finally, the students got there, and they started just going on. One student said, "Did Jesus really say that?" And I said, "Well, I really wouldn't lie from the pulpit. Yes, Jesus really said that." And we got to talking about the word, and we got to talking about the debt system of the ancient world, etc. And the students were just absolutely compelled. And another one of them finally just sort of piped up and said, "See, yeah, I don't think you realize the power of that and what you said in your sermon." I said, "Well, tell me." And one of the young women said, "You see, that's what we're dreaming of too." And then they got kind of angry. And they said, "We've never heard this in church before. Is this really the message of Jesus? Is this really the center of the gospel? Is that Jesus is talking about taking down debt and living in an entirely different economy?" And I said, "Yeah." And one of the students said, "I never knew that Jesus sounded like Bernie Sanders." And I just kept my cool, and I said, "Well, they're both Jews." I think they get the story from the same place, actually. And that's it. So Jesus was always talking about a different economy. One shaped not around a pyramid, but around a table. A table that would always be laden with food. A table to which everyone was invited. This illustration is from a Methodist pastor, spiritual director in Florida by the name of Jan Richardson. And she lets me use her art very nicely. And you can see it's, looking down from this sort of top-down vision of a table. And there's people from all over, all these different colors of skin and different kinds of clothing, sitting at the table. Somebody just found it. There's a cat. I usually ask people, "Where's the dog?" Where is the dog? Under the table, that's exactly right. Going from place to place to place, seeing what the dog can get. That's the dog. But the cat has its own chair. And so this is it. This is the dream of God, my friends, is that we will all forever feast at a table together. This, of course, is the story of Holy Week. This is what happens on that Thursday night, right before Jesus is executed by the empire. Jesus has a feast, and that is the Last Supper of the old imperial world, and it is the first supper of the forever feast that will be the kingdom of God. That is the crux. That is the center. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Give us this day our daily bread. This is the economy of God. This is the shalom, the hoped for vision that is in the Hebrew Bible. This is the great jubilee that will last every single day, all the time, forever. in the kingdom of God. This is God's economy. Walter Brueggemann, over years, wrote beautifully about this. I'm sure you've read things and heard sermons preached that were inspired by one of the greatest Presbyterian exegetes of the 20th and early 21st century. Brueggemann got it and tried to convince all the rest of us of the truth of it as well, because it is that important in terms of understanding the gospel. And so what we see when it comes to gratitude is something that's really quite startling, is that so much of our language and our understanding of gratitude is caught up in an ancient pyramid that haunts us still. Debt, obligation, transaction, skimming, quid pro quo, you must. And the truth of it is that when we sit at this table, all of that disappears. What is left is friendship and pass the mashed potatoes. You know, it's literally just making sure that everyone who is sitting at the table is fed and that everybody has something to eat. All are seated and all are sated. And I just love this because when I realized how the social imaginary that we carry around inside, the social structure that we carry around inside of our own brains and somewhere in our deep histories is tied up with ancient Rome, an imperial system of economic extractive transaction, where you and I, my friends, even the richest person in this room, would have been at the bottom. Congratulations. We're the plebeians at best. And more likely, we're the workers, the colonized, or the enslaved. We don't really like to think about ourselves in this way. But think about our culture and how everything in our culture is about clawing our way to the top. It's about trying to figure out how you get yours so that before they get theirs. How many people have every one of us actually kicked in the face in our quest to the top, and we justify it? Oh, we're just trying to take care of ourselves. We're just trying to take care of our families. And the reason we have to justify it is because the whole social structure of the United States is such that it tries to limit the idea of the resources. There's not enough, and I have to get my part because nobody's going to be there to take care of me. But what if the whole system and structure is just wrong? What if the biblical structure is actually entirely different? What if we're all at table? That's what the kids are dreaming of. Something different than this. It always helps to point out that pyramid structures in the Bible always come to a bad end. From the Tower of Babel here, all the way through the pyramids of ancient Egypt, up and through Caesar's reign of hierarchy. Not good. The pyramid structures are always criticized. This week, I spent a little time reading 1 Samuel. Love 1 Samuel chapter 8. Look at what a geek I am, huh? 1 Samuel chapter 8 is where the people of Israel, who have now their own land, they're sitting there in their own place, which is supposed to be the land of milk and honey. And this is where Shalom is supposed to take place. This is where Sabbath is supposed to take place. This is where the Jubilee is supposed to be happening. Everybody's supposed to be having their own vine and fig tree. So this is the place. They have the judges with them. Notice, nobody over them. Judges sit within community and make decisions, not over community and send decisions down. The way that this was structured in the Bible was the judge was the wise person within the tribe. And hearing from all parts of the tribe, and it was from hearing the whole of the community that the judge would adjudicate what was right and what was justice. And that was the system in early Israel. Well, Israel looked at this, and they looked at what was going on around them, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, all these empires. And they turned to God and said, hey, God, this is great. We like vines and fig trees. We like these judges you've given us. Good thing. But what we really want is a king, because guess what? We want to be just like the neighbors. And those kings, by the way, those empires, they have really big armies, and we're kind of scared of that, and we don't really trust in your provision. We would like a big army too. And so we want a king. And God comes back to them through Samuel and says, no, you don't. I'm not going to give you a king. And because it's not a good thing. It never ends well, God says. And they come back and they say, no, we want a king. And then God says, I'm not kidding you. This will end badly because I really, 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 really don't like social structures that are set up like this, because terrible things happen to most people when you have kings. And then the people come back, no, we want a king. And finally Samuel, God delivers a word to Samuel and says, tell them this. And there's this long list of all the awful things that will happen to you if you have a king, including the fact that your children will be drafted for the army, that the king will raise your taxes, that the king will steal from you. I mean, it is like incredible if you read that whole list of stuff. It goes on for about 3-4 verses of all of the terrible results of having a king. And God says then, this is what will happen, and in that day you will rue having asked for a king. And when you get to that point, guess what? I'm not going to listen to you anymore. You're going to have to live with your consequences. God says this in 1 Samuel. And so Samuel goes and he tells the Israelites all of this. And they say, we want a king. And that little verse right there, that section, 1 Samuel 8, becomes the hinge for the whole rest of the Hebrew scriptures. Because everything after that are basically the prophets coming in and saying, look at all the terrible things that kings are doing. And there is no justice in the land because you gave up the tables in the wilderness, judges being within your bounds, your vines and fig trees. You traded them for a pyramid of power over top of you that would extract your wealth, kill your children, and enslave you. And you did it. And so then the prophets say, how do you get out of this mess? And that's what the rest of the Bible is about. And it is just a stunning, the Old Testament is a sustained, stunning story about the failure of empire. And when we get into the New Testament, that's what's behind Jesus. And Jesus is born during the reign of Caesar Augustus, who called for the entire world to be taxed. That's the opening of the Gospel of Luke. The Messiah is born when there is a king who thinks that he is the Lord and Savior of the universe, who calls for the entire world to be taxed. And the whole story of the Messiah is speaking against that vision. Speaking against that Roman power, quietly sometimes, subversively sometimes, overtly at other times, until the empire kills him on Good Friday. Now, get back to gratitude, what that has to do with it all, of course, is very interesting. These are just 2 more slides, and then this surprising lecture on gratitude will come to an end from my slideshow perspective, at least. Brother David Stendhal Rast, who is one of the great thinkers on gratitude in our own day, he, I believe, is 97 this year. He is still alive, still writes, he's amazing. He did a TED Talk about 20 years ago, which this comment was included. And was talking about how there's a new longing for gratitude and the practices of gratitude. And I love this quote. There is a wave of gratefulness because people are becoming aware of how important this is and how this can change the world. Well, how does gratitude change the world? Just by saying thank you and all this kind of thing? Well, he says this is exactly the path. If you're grateful, you're not fearful. Notice the people of Israel. Remember, they were afraid of the armies of the neighboring countries. They had forgotten to be grateful to God as their protector, and they were afraid, and they wanted protection. And so they asked for something different. If you're grateful, you're not fearful. If you're not fearful, you're not violent. Fear is the source of violence. If you're grateful, you act out of a sense of enough and not a sense of scarcity, and you are willing to share. If you are grateful, you are enjoying the differences between people, and you are respectful to everybody. And this changes, this power pyramid under which we live. Gratitude undermines the foundations of the pyramid and replaces the pyramid with the table. That's what I learned about gratefulness when I wrote my book. It's an amazing practice. Keep a journal, carry around a gratitude stone, say thank you, be kind, all those kinds of things that are tied up in a life of practicing. Write thank you notes to your grandmother. All those things that are tied up in the practice of gratitude. But why? Why? Because it's an obligation? Because it's going to make you forget the bad news that's on the television all the time? It's going to just make you feel better, and you can live in a little flowery cocoon and ignore the rest of the world, which I'm afraid some people are trying to do right now. But no, Jesus says, practice gratitude because it is the center of the vision of God for an entirely different organization of society, for an entirely different economy, for an entirely different way of being with one another, a way that Jesus himself demonstrated in the last week of his life, and a way that is open for us to embody, however imperfectly, however awkwardly, however difficult it is, to embody in our own lives and communities here and now. And which one do we want to live in? Honestly, who really wants to live in a pyramid-structured society? It is bad for most people. But who wants to be at the table? Everybody likes a dinner invitation. One time, someone asked me, Diana, you really like spiritual practices, and you speak well about tradition, all these things. Why aren't you Roman Catholic? And I said, well, I would be, except nobody will make me Pope. And that's just a way of thinking about that pyramid structure world. We all want to think that we'll be the person on the top. We all think we can make it. And that's not true. That side of the board here, that is a big myth. And we don't talk about it as a myth. In America, we talk about it like it's a reality. That picture right there could actually be good. When the Bible we claim to read in a supposedly Christian-informed society actually tells the complete opposite story. It tells a story how pyramids are always bad, and the only social structure that matters is the table. So, cool. We have time for just a couple questions here, and I would love to take a few.
Yeah. I've got a microphone here, obviously, and maybe a question or two, if there are any questions for Diana. First of all, round of applause for Diana.
Oh, Thank you. The attempt today is to have you switch around your imaginations of how you carry around stories that inform how you think about really important issues. And right now, I'm actually quite convinced that one of the deepest problems in the United States is that we're carrying around a whole host of stories that have proven themselves to be inadequate or lies. And that the Christian community, that our book, our traditions, the Bible, our Jesus, was actually carrying around a whole bunch of other stories that we have not really looked at as honestly as we should. And so much of my work is about that, trying to get us to peel back the myths that we've been sold by our culture and see the Bible more clearly and what it presents to us. And I think that gratitude really gets caught up in this.
One of those powerful stories, yeah.
Yeah. So
Any thoughts, any questions?
I know it's a Sunday afternoon, it's after lunch.
Yes, Jack.
Mm-hmm. And we'll try to keep them short.
How do we live and survive in the pyramid in which we find ourselves?
You know, I think that is a really good question. How do we live and survive in a pyramid in which we find ourselves? One of the most interesting moments when I was first presenting this material, and I've always used the pyramid. I had an older and different set of slides, but I've always used the Roman pyramid to talk about it. And I was in Seattle. It was at one of the early events for this. This was 2019. And Seattle is a largely white place. Washington State is that way. But there was 3 or 4 African-American women who were in that particular audience. And after I gave the lecture, they came up to me and said how much they were all for the pastors in different African-American denominations. And they talked about how much they loved the pyramid. And they said, do you know much about African-American history? And I said, well, yeah, I have a PhD in American religious history, so I had to know a lot about it. They said, but we don't really think you get it. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, the whole point of the history and the iconography and the theology and the musical life of African-American experience in our country was trying to create tables underneath pyramids. And I literally went, I got chills when these women said this, because when you ask the question, how do we live under a pyramid? There's nobody in this country who knows more about living under pyramids than the people among us who were literally by law forced to live underneath a pyramid in the South. Because we have had in our recent history laws in the United States against ingratitude. And those laws were mostly in southern states, where if a black person who was held in slavery ever showed anything less than loyalty to his or her master, that person could be whipped, sent to prison, or executed. And so to be an ingrate and be a black person, and then that stretched over after freedom, after the war, into Jim Crow laws, how dangerous it was for a black person to be an ingrate to a white person. It was a very dangerous thing to do. So what had to happen is in black communities, they talk about something called the beloved community, which is essentially, if you look at how they understand it, it's essentially like a table. And those tables are formed, as my friend said in that lecture, after that lecture, we form them underneath the base of the pyramid. And if you have the tables underneath the base of the pyramid, you're destabilizing the pyramid. That's the other way to do it, is to actually form the kind of community that you're dreaming of, a community of liberation, freedom, provision, gratitude, all those things. And you just do it, but you're functioning in an environment in which something else is being put on top of you. And eventually, their dream, the dream of many African American people, has always been that the power of the table would rise up and modify, at minimum, and perhaps overthrow the pyramid. And see, white people know that thing about overthrowing the pyramid because, see, we think we're on top. And so when we hear the idea of a table destabilizing a pyramid, we think, oh, well, that means we're going to be on the bottom. No, it just means we're all invited to the table. When a pyramid gets destabilized, the bad result is that the people who are on the top of the pyramid get put at the bottom of a new pyramid because we're stuck on pyramids. But if you can already have in place the subversion of the table, when the pyramid shows its inability to govern fairly, when the pyramid shows that its actual instability or it's injustice. There's no way a pyramid structure can ever be a just structure. And so when that's finally revealed, and the table has a chance to rise up, what can happen is the people who are on the table in the pyramid get invited to the table. And that's the vision. That's what King was talking about when King talked about a world church, or King was talking about the beloved community. It wasn't that the people at the top would be hurt. It was the people at the top would understand that they were slaves too. And that by setting up these tables that were ready to go with the feast, everyone would be seated and everyone would be fed. I'll never forget that conversation with those 4 women. I never felt the power of welcome as much as I did with their response to this material. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is a little story. You said so wonderful.
Oh, can you give her the microphone? Because I know the people at the edges can't hear. Yes, please use the mic, because it's very helpful to your friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
And underneath the table is the dog. And when you spell dog backwards,
It's
it's
God.
God. I just had to finish it.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be greedy with Diana's remaining energy bank and time bank so that she has a chance to meet some of you and sign some books in another room. Diana's going to be in the chapel in a few minutes. I'm going to walk her over there. So if you have not had a chance to get a book, there's still a chance to do that. If you have a book and you'd like it signed, you can bring it over to that area for a few more minutes. Please, one last time, give Diana a thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.